Hi, this is Ashish from developerhut.net and welcome to Java Design Pattern series. So, in today's session, we are going to see the most famous and the simplest Java design pattern, which is Singleton Design Pattern. So, in this session, we will be going to see what is Singleton Design Pattern and why we use the Singleton Design Pattern. What is the Singleton classes in Singleton Design Pattern, and what are the rules to create the Singleton Design Pattern? And we will also going to see the multiple ways to create the Singleton classes, like lazy initialization, double check locking, and the early initialization. So now let's see what is Singleton classes and Singleton Design Pattern. So Singleton class is an essential part of the Singleton Design Pattern. So Singleton class is such a class where you can create only one object of that particular classes. Okay, so let's say if I have a Singleton class and there can be a multiple reference who are referring to it. However, the object will be only one. Even if you try to create, or you call the method multiple times, it will return the same object. Okay, so this class is basically publicly accessible to throughout your application so that multiple reference can refer to it to the single object. Now the basic advantage is any modification done inside this object is available for the all the reference who are referring to it. Okay, the the primary purpose of the singleton design pattern is to restrict the number of object creation to only one. Okay, so this is the basic advantage of singleton design class, as its name suggests, right? So the singleton design pattern used in a lot of places. So for example, your application configuration class, where you need your configuration initialize configuration only once. So for example, if you have a database configuration class which is holding database connection and all those things, right? So you don't want it to create multiple connections all the time, right? Because your database connection class will be accessed in most of their places in your inside your application. So your database configuration you can make it a singleton, right? Then singleton classes can be used in a caching. Singleton classes can also use in a logging framework. So if you remember your favorite log4j internally use the singleton design pattern. So here you can see you are calling the multiple your methods of the logger, right? And you are adding multiple logs from multiple classes. However, your all the logs go into the singleton single file, right? So this is the best example of a singleton design pattern, right? So now what are the different rules to create the singleton classes? So there are basic three rules to create the singleton class. So first is the class must have the private constructor. That is the first basic rule. Okay, so if you have public constructor, you can call and create the object from anywhere, right? So for that, to restrict that, we create a constructor which is private in nature. Okay, then next is you need to create the public static method which will return the same class object, which is a singleton class object. So why we need this? Because your constructor here is a private. So if constructor is private, then it can be called within that particular class only. Okay, now if you want to create the object, you need some method or some way to reach to that class and get that object, right? So we will create the public static method which will create this object basis on some condition, and then it will return it back. Okay, and the last requirement is you need to create the private static instance variable, because you are creating the public static method, you are creating the object inside this method, right? So you need a static instance variable so that you can return it back, right? So now let's move ahead and create the singleton class. So let's create a singleton class. So I will say class, I will say singleton. Okay, and I will create the first thing that we need to create is the private constructor, right? So I will say private singleton, right? So I have a private constructor now. Okay, and next thing is we need to create a public static method. So I will say public static, which will return a same class object, which is singleton in our case, and I will say get instance. Okay, and here I will say return new singleton, right? These are the this is the second one. Now the third is we need to create the private static instance variable. So I will say private static, and I will say singleton, and I will say instance, right? So I have a private static instance variable now. So instead of creating a new object, I will simply return the instance, right? Now here it is still, say, our singleton class is still not yet completed. So here what we need to do, we need to create the object, right? So new singleton, right? So now we have created the object. However, every time if you call the get instance method, it will create the new object all the time, right? So you need to add some condition, right? So I will say if my instance, right, is equal to null, then and only then create the object, right? So if your instance is null, then only then create your object, right? Now here if you see, if you call this method first time, it will check whether instance is null. Yes, it's null, and then it will create an object and it will return back the instance reference variable, right? If in the second time when you call the instance get instance method, it will know that the instance is not null this time, so it will return the instance. So only one object gets created, right? So now let's create this object. So let's test this out. So I will say singleton, I will say object 1 is equal to singleton dot get instance, right? And I will simply say object 1, right? So now if you run this, you will get the hash code, default toString implementation. So it returns the hash code of the object, so which is this. However, we still don't know whether this is working or not. So what I will do, I will just simply change the reference variable. So I will create another reference variable and I will call the get instance again, and let's see if we get the same object or not. So there you go, you can see. So we are getting the same object, right? So anytime if you call this, you will still get the same object. Okay, so this form of singleton implementation is basically called as the lazy initialization, because you are initializing the singleton object lazily, right? So whenever you call the get instance method, at that time you will create the object, call the constructor, and you will return it back. So this is called as basically the lazy initialization. So now let's say your application is accessing in a multi-threaded environment, right? So there are multiple threads you are creating and you are calling the get instance method, right? So let's say there are two threads who are accessing the instance for the first time, get instance method calling the first time, and they are calling at the same time, right? So thread 1 reached to this line of code, it will check instance is null, and then it will create object and get it back, get the actual class object, right? On the second thread also comes to the same line again, and before creating the object, thread 2 knows that this condition evaluates, right? And it will still, this becomes true because object is still not yet created. So in that case, thread 2 will again go to this line and this will create the new singleton object. So there might be chances that these two threads get a two different object, and your singleton pattern breaks in this case, right? So what you can do in this case is, so in this case you can simply add the synchronization, right? So the synchronized block. So I will add the synchronized block so that multiple threads creating the multiple objects, you can prevent it, right? So I will say synchronized. I will say singleton dot class, right? And I will simply add the synchronized, all this code in synchronized block, right? So I will go here and I will add it. Okay, so what happened in this case? Now if thread comes here and it's still this another thread is not accessing it, right? The first thread come, it will go inside this. However, at the same time, if second thread comes again here, it has to wait because the first operation is still not yet completed, right? So you can add the synchronized block this way. However, there can be chances that again the synchronized block get broke, right? So in that case also, what you can do, you can simply you know add one more check over here. Okay, so I will go simply here and I will add it. So basically this is called as a double check locking. So why you need this? So for example, let's say if your object in your inside your constructor, singleton constructor, there are some operation you are adding it, right? So it might be a very heavy logic you are adding, which is taking more CPU utilization, or you are adding expensive IO calls or database related operations, right? So in that case, this object gets time to create, right? And if it comes over here, there might be chances that the other thread got the same condition, that instead is still null, right? And it can create another object. To prevent it, we will add this, right? This check. So here you can see we are checking the instance is null or not the multiple times. So first is here, then we add a synchronized block, and then we are checking it here again, right? So this mechanism is called as a double check locking mechanism, because you are checking the first time, then locking it, and then again checking it, okay, to prevent the creating multiple instance of the singleton object. So now this can be this is the double check locking mechanism. Now here you can do it in very simple way. So it is called as a early initialization. So instead of creating object lazily, there can be situations that you can create the object at the time of class loading, right? So what you can do is you can simply uh, create the class at the beginning, right? And then you do not require this, right? So I will just simply comment it out, right? So this is basically called as the early initialization, because you are creating the class, you are initializing the class at the start, right? At the start of your maybe your class loading. So this is the early initialization. This way you can you know skip all this double check locking and all the if checks, whatever you want, right? However, the early initialization and lazy initialization have their own advantages, right? So you can initialize according to your application or your business needs, okay? So there are also more ways to in the lazy initialization. You can also use the static holder class, right? So you can create an inner class, and there you can create the instance of your singleton class, right, to prevent your creating the multiple objects. Or you can use enum as well, okay? So this is this was all about the singleton design pattern. I hope you understood the concept of singleton design pattern, the lazy initialization and the early initialization. So if you have any questions, you can add your question, your comments, your feedback in the comment section below. And if you think this information is valuable, please do like this video, do share this video, and subscribe to my channel. Thank you.